The seismologist was in the middle of a routine data review when the event appeared in the catalog, and for approximately 3 seconds, she processed it the way she processed every small earthquake in the Pacific Northwest monitoring catalog, with the automatic professional scan that assesses location, depth, magnitude, and the match between the observed waveform and the template library, and that, in the vast majority of cases, produces no result other than a confirmed entry in the regional earthquake record. The earthquake was a magnitude 3.1. Its epicenter was in the offshore region of the Oregon coast, at a depth that placed it in the upper part of the subducting oceanic plate, rather than in the overlying continental crust. The waveform was clean, consistent with a simple tectonic mechanism, no complexity that would suggest an unusual source process. In isolation, it was the kind of earthquake that the Pacific Northwest produces several times a week, unremarkable in every individual characteristic, forgettable in the way that the hundreds of thousands of small earthquakes that accumulate in the regional catalog each year are forgettable. She almost moved on. The professional reflex was to log it, confirm the automated solution, and continue through the review queue. But something stopped her, not a specific anomalous feature in the earthquake itself, but a context that she carried in her working memory from a meeting 2 days earlier, a meeting in which her colleague had presented the analysis of the geodetic anomaly, the 11 months of anomalous GPS data from the Oregon coastal network that had been quietly accumulating in the monitoring data, while no one was paying close enough attention. The anomaly had put the Cascadia research community in a state of focused attention, a careful watching of every data stream that produced information about the subduction zone's current mechanical state. And it was this context, this specific watchfulness, that caused her to look more carefully at the magnitude 3.1 before logging it and moving on. What she looked at, when she turned her attention fully to the event instead of scanning it, was its location relative to the geodetic anomaly. The GPS stations that had shown the 11 months of anomalous slow deformation were distributed along the Oregon coast in a pattern that the inverse modeling had associated with a source region at depths between 25 and 40 kilometers on the subduction interface, in the zone where the locked and transitional sections of the fault met. The earthquake she was looking at was at a depth of 28 kilometers, in the lower part of the locked zone, approximately 60 kilometers along, strike from the region of maximum geodetic anomaly signal. 60 kilometers was not the same location, but 60 kilometers on a fault system that was 1,000 kilometers long was not far either. She pulled up the catalog for the previous 6 months and filtered for events in the same depth range and the same general along-strike location. There were 4 previous events in the filtered catalog, all below magnitude 2.5, all previously logged without special note. She looked at their timing relative to the geodetic anomaly's onset, which the analysis had placed at approximately 11 months before the graduate student had found it in the GPS data, meaning the onset was approximately 22 months ago. 3 of the 4 previously logged events in the depth and location range had occurred in the past 18 months. 1 had occurred 4 years ago. The rate of seismicity in this specific depth range and location had increased in the period that overlapped with the geodetic anomaly. It was not a large change in rate, 4 events in 18 months versus 1 event in the previous 4 years, but on a subduction zone that was supposed to be locked and storing elastic strain, on a fault interface that was not supposed to be producing small earthquakes because locked faults do not generate the seismicity that freely slipping faults generate. The occurrence of any seismicity in the specific depth and location range of the locked zone was significant. The occurrence of an increased rate of seismicity in that range during the same period as an anomalous geodetic signal that the research community was still working to understand was more than significant. It was the kind of coincidence that, in seismology, is not assumed to be a coincidence until the data has been examined carefully enough to rule out a physical connection. She flagged the event with a priority notation and sent a message to the Cascadia Research Group mailing list. The message was 4 sentences long. The last sentence read, "Given the geodetic context, I think this is worth a careful look before we decide it is ordinary." By the following morning, 6 members of the research group were examining the same catalog entries from 6 different analytical perspectives. By the end of that week, the careful look had become a coordinated investigation, and the coordinated investigation was producing findings that were making the scientists involved less comfortable, not more, with every passing day. The Cascadia Subduction Zone in the current period, 326 years after the last full rupture great earthquake in January 1700, is a system that the scientific community understands in broad terms, but not in the specific terms, that would allow confident assessment of where it is in its current loading cycle. The broad understanding is well established. The Juan de Fuca plate is being driven beneath the North American plate at a convergence rate of approximately 3 to 4 centimeters per year, accumulating elastic strain in the locked zone of the subduction interface at a rate that GPS measurements have been documenting since the early 1990s. The locked zone extends from shallow offshore depths to approximately 20 to 30 kilometers beneath the coast. depending on the specific location along the arc, where the thermal conditions in the descending plate allow the transition from brittle locking to ductile flow. Below the locked zone, the transition zone hosts the episodic tremor and slip events that are the most distinctive behavioral signature of Cascadia among global subduction zones, and that have been the subject of intensive research since their discovery in the early 2000s. The specific question about where in its loading cycle the Cascadia Subduction Zone currently sits is one that the scientific community has been working to answer with increasing urgency as the tools for monitoring and analyzing the subduction zone's behavior have improved. The paleoseismic record, which is the primary basis for estimating the recurrence interval of great Cascadia earthquakes and for assessing the elapsed time since the last event relative to the expected interval, places the current elapsed time within the range of historical inter-event intervals, but does not establish with confidence whether the current period is in the early, middle, or late phase of the typical cycle. The GPS measurements document the current rate of strain accumulation and the current distribution of locking on the interface, providing a snapshot of the current stress state, but not an absolute measure of the total accumulated stress because the baseline from which the accumulation is measured, the state of the interface immediately after the 1700 earthquake, is not directly known from any observation. The specific behavioral indicators that the scientific community is watching for as potential signals that the subduction zone is approaching a critical loading state include changes in the ETS behavior, changes in the GPS deformation pattern, changes in the seismicity of the transition zone and the adjacent regions, and the specific observation that the current coordinated investigation is examining most intensively: the occurrence of small earthquakes in the depth range and location of the locked zone during a period when the geodetic monitoring has been showing anomalous behavior. The significance of small earthquakes occurring in the locked zone of a subduction fault is not immediately obvious without some background in how subduction zone seismicity is normally distributed. The standard understanding of a locked subduction interface, based on the mechanical model of two rough surfaces in frictional contact under the normal stress imposed by the weight of the overlying plate, is that the locked zone generates seismicity primarily during its rupture in a great earthquake, and does not generate significant seismicity in the interseismic period. The locked zone is quiet in the standard model because the frictional contact prevents the differential motion that generates earthquakes, and because the elastic deformation that the lock produces is distributed smoothly through the surrounding crust rather than concentrated in the brittle failure events that produce seismicity. This standard picture is accurate in its broad outlines but incomplete in its details. Locked subduction zones are not perfectly locked over their entire area. They have heterogeneous locking, with some areas more tightly locked than others, and with gradients in the locking fraction that produce local stress concentrations at the boundaries between highly locked and less locked regions. These stress concentrations can, in some circumstances, produce small earthquakes even in the interseismic period. Earthquakes that are generated not by differential slip across the main locked interface, but by the secondary effects of the stress field heterogeneity on small faults and fractures in the crust adjacent to the interface. The occurrence of such seismicity is therefore not completely unprecedented and is not by itself definitive evidence that the locked zone is approaching rupture. What is significant about the current observation is not the occurrence of small earthquakes at locked zone depths in itself, but the combination of their occurrence with the geodetic anomaly and, crucially, their timing. The timing question is, what is driving the specific discomfort that the scientists involved in the investigation are experiencing? Because the timing places the onset of the increased seismicity rate in the same period as the onset of the geodetic anomaly, and the probability of this temporal coincidence occurring by chance, if the two signals are genuinely independent, is low enough to motivate the investigation that is currently underway. The investigation has been examining the relationship between the geodetic anomaly and the seismic observations using several complementary approaches. The first approach is the statistical analysis of the seismicity rate change, applying the standard tests for rate changes in earthquake catalogs to determine whether the increase in seismicity rate in the relevant depth and location range is statistically significant, and how much of the increase can be attributed to the temporal coincidence with the geodetic anomaly. The statistical analysis confirms that the rate change is significant by the standard tests, that the probability of observing a rate change of this magnitude in this catalog by chance alone is below the standard threshold for statistical significance. This confirmation establishes that something real changed in the seismicity rate at the relevant location and depth. It does not establish why. The second approach is the stress modeling analysis, applying the column stress transfer framework to the question of whether the slow slip inferred from the geodetic anomaly could have produced stress changes at the location and depth of the observed seismicity that are large enough and in the right orientation to explain the rate change, This analysis requires the construction of a physical model of the slow slip source with specific parameters for the location, orientation, dimensions, and slip amount of the slow slip event that the geodetic anomaly reflects, and the calculation of the Coulomb stress change from that slow slip source at the locations where the seismicity has occurred. The preliminary results of this analysis are consistent with a causal connection between the slow slip and the seismicity rate change, in the sense that the calculated stress change from the slow slip source is positive, meaning in the direction of failure at the locations of the observed earthquakes. The positive stress change is small, consistent with the small magnitude of the slow slip event, but it is positive, and it is in the right orientation. The third approach is the waveform analysis, examining the focal mechanisms of the small earthquakes to determine the specific orientation of the fault planes on which they occurred and the direction of slip on those planes, and comparing the inferred fault geometry and slip direction to the geometry and slip direction of the slow slip source inferred from the geodetic data. A causal connection between the slow slip and the seismicity would predict that the fault planes of the small earthquakes should be oriented in a specific geometric relationship to the slow slip source, consistent with the Coulomb stress change calculation. The waveform analysis of the small earthquakes is challenging because the small magnitudes produce emergent, low-amplitude waveforms that make first motion polarity determinations, the standard basis for focal mechanism calculation, less reliable than for larger events. But the preliminary focal mechanism solutions that have been obtained are broadly consistent with the geometric relationship predicted by the stress modeling within the uncertainty of the solutions. The three independent lines of evidence, the statistical significance of the rate change, the positive Coulomb stress change from the slow slip source, and the geometric consistency of the focal mechanisms are converging on the same interpretive conclusion. The small earthquakes that are occurring at locked zone depths in the vicinity of the geodetic anomaly are most likely being triggered by the stress changes produced by the slow slip event that the geodetic anomaly reflects. This conclusion does not prove that the slow slip event is itself an indicator of elevated near-term rupture risk for the locked zone above it, but it does establish that the slow slip is producing measurable mechanical effects in the locked zone, effects that are being expressed in the seismicity record and that provide an independent line of evidence for the physical connection between the slow slip and the locked zone's current stress state. The implications of this interpretive conclusion for the near-term hazard assessment of the Cascadia Subduction Zone are the dimension of the investigation that is generating the most concern among the scientists involved and the most careful attention to the question of what the evidence actually supports and what it does not. The scientific community that studies subduction zone hazard has been burned before by premature interpretations of precursory signals, by the overstatement of the significance of specific observations in the context of the enormous difficulty of earthquake prediction, and by the erosion of scientific credibility that follows from overstated claims that are not subsequently validated. The discipline of being careful about what the evidence supports is not bureaucratic caution. It is the accumulated wisdom of a community that has learned through repeated painful experience that the desire to find the signal that precedes the earthquake can produce the perception of a signal where the evidence only shows noise. With this discipline in mind, the investigation is being careful about the specific claim that the convergence of the geodetic anomaly and the seismicity rate change justifies. The claim that is supported is that the Cascadia Subduction Zone is showing signs of unusual mechanical behavior in a specific region of the interface, behavior that is outside the normal range of the ETS cycle, and that involves both slow slip in the transition zone and triggered seismicity in the locked zone, and that these unusual behaviors are occurring during a period when the elapsed time since the last great earthquake is within the range of historical recurrence intervals. The claim that is not supported, and that the scientists involved in the investigation are being explicit about not making, is that this unusual behavior is a reliable precursory signal for a specific near-term rupture of the main locked zone. The distinction between these two claims matters for how the findings are communicated and for what the practical response to them should be. The first claim, the one the evidence supports, has implications for the hazard assessment and for the preparedness posture of the agencies and communities responsible for managing the Cascadia hazard. It suggests that the probability distribution for a major Cascadia earthquake in the current period may be shifted toward higher near-term probability relative to what the long-term average would suggest, not dramatically but meaningfully, in the way that any specific indicator of a fault system's current loading state shifts the assessment from the featureless long-term average toward something that incorporates the current evidence. This kind of probabilistic update, while less dramatic than a specific prediction, is exactly the kind of information that hazard-informed decision-making processes are designed to incorporate. The second claim, the one the evidence does not support, would be that a great Cascadia earthquake is imminent, or that the current observations should trigger emergency response actions. This claim is not supported because the physical understanding of how slow slip and triggered seismicity relate to the timing of locked zone rupture is not sufficiently developed to support such a specific causal link, and because the historical record of subduction zones, including Cascadia itself, contains episodes of anomalous slow slip and elevated seismicity that were not followed by a major earthquake in the near term. The unusual behavior may be a signal of elevated loading state. It is not a reliable prediction of imminent rupture. The specific detail that is making the timing of this small earthquake feel particularly significant to the scientists who are aware of the full context is not simply the combination of the geodetic anomaly and the seismicity rate change. It is the location of the magnitude 3.1 event within the geography of the locked zone and its relationship to the specific section of the Cascadia Subduction Zone that the paleoseismic evidence and the GPS deformation modeling have identified as having the most complete and the tightest locking in the current interseismic period. The Cascadia Subduction Zone is not uniformly locked along its 1,000-kilometer length. The southern section, offshore northern California and southern Oregon, is the most thoroughly locked in the current period, showing the strongest coupling between the subducting and overriding plates and the highest rate of strain accumulation as measured by the GPS network. The central section, offshore central and northern Oregon, shows strong but somewhat variable coupling with specific patches of high coupling embedded in regions of lower coupling. The northern section, offshore Washington and British Columbia, shows coupling that is strong, but that is modulated by the influence of the geometry of the subducting plate on the fault's locking behavior in this region. The magnitude 3.1 earthquake was located in the depth range and a long strike position that corresponds to the lower boundary of the most tightly locked section of the Central Oregon segment, the specific part of the locked zone where the geodetic modeling has placed the greatest concentration of elastic strain in the current interseismic period. This is not the same as saying the earthquake occurred on the main locked interface. The depth, uncertainty in the event location, at 28 kilometers, places it in the depth range that could be either the very bottom of the locked zone or the top of the transition zone. And the distinction matters for the physical interpretation. But the location at the lower boundary of the most tightly locked section means that any stress changes from below, whether from the slow slip in the transition zone or from the gradual strain accumulation in the locked zone itself, would be concentrated in this region, and that the small earthquakes occurring here are sampling the stress state of the part of the locked zone that is most energetically loaded. The seismologist who flagged the event has been tracking the location question with specific attention since the coordinated investigation began, because the location relative to the maximum locking section is the detail that elevates the significance of the observation beyond a generic statement about unusual behavior on the subduction zone to a specific statement about unusual behavior in the most critical part of the fault. A small earthquake at the bottom of the most tightly locked section of the fault during a period of anomalous slow slip in the transition zone below it, occurring in a sequence of elevated seismicity rate that has developed over the same 18 months as the geodetic anomaly in the depth and location range that the stress modeling predicts should receive positive Coulomb stress from the slow slip source. This combination of specifics is what is making the scientists involved uncomfortable in the productive sense, the kind of discomfort that comes from encountering evidence that is pointing in a consistent direction before the investigation has been completed. The Pacific Northwest communities that would be most directly affected by a major Cascadia earthquake are communities that have been the subject of significant and sustained public education about the Cascadia hazard over the past decade, driven in large part by Catherine Schultz's 2015 New Yorker article that brought the Cascadia hazard to broad public awareness, and by the subsequent engagement of state and federal agencies in developing and implementing the preparedness programs that the level of hazard demands. The public education has produced measurable improvements in earthquake preparedness in the region, including higher rates of household earthquake preparedness, kit assembly, higher rates of participation in the shakeout earthquake drills, and higher rates of public awareness of the tsunami hazard associated with a Cascadia event. The preparedness improvements, while genuine and significant, remain incomplete relative to what the hazard warrants. The resilience of the critical infrastructure, the school buildings and hospital buildings and bridges and water systems and port facilities that would need to function during a major Cascadia earthquake response, varies widely across the region, with some elements having been substantially improved through focused investment and others remaining at vulnerability levels that the seismic engineering community has documented as inadequate. The retrofit programs that would address these vulnerabilities are ongoing but are not complete, and the timeline for completion, even at the current investment rate, extends for years to decades. The current scientific findings, if they motivate additional investment in completing the retrofit programs and in enhancing the preparedness of the most vulnerable communities, would represent the most direct practical benefit of the investigation. The findings do not predict a specific earthquake. but they provide additional motivation for the preparedness investments that the hazard has always warranted, and they do so at a moment in the hazard cycle when the elapsed time since the last great earthquake is within the historical recurrence range, and when the monitoring data is showing unusual behavior. The combination of these factors is a more compelling case for urgency in the preparedness investment than the long-term average hazard assessment alone can provide. The specific communities most immediately relevant to the current scientific findings are the coastal communities of the central Oregon coast, in the vicinity of the along strike location where the elevated seismicity and the maximum geodetic anomaly signal have been detected. These communities sit within the potential tsunami inundation zone for a major Cascadia earthquake, and their preparedness for the tsunami hazard is the most time-sensitive dimension of their overall Cascadia preparedness. The window between the occurrence of a great Cascadia earthquake and the arrival of the first tsunami wave at the coast is approximately 15 to 20 minutes for the nearest coastal sections, a window that is short enough that community preparedness for immediate self-evacuation is the most critical factor in the human survival outcome. The Oregon Office of Emergency Management and the local emergency management agencies of the coastal counties in the region of the scientific findings have been briefed on the current investigation through the channels that exist for communicating scientific findings of potential operational significance to the emergency management community. The briefings have been careful to convey the genuine uncertainty in the findings and the specific claims that the evidence supports and does not support, and the emergency management response has been appropriately calibrated to the probabilistic update that the findings represent, rather than to the specific prediction that they do not constitute. The specific preparedness actions that the briefings have motivated in the emergency management community include a review of the current status of the tsunami evacuation routes in the most exposed coastal communities, confirmation that the Shake Alert earthquake early warning system is functioning correctly for the offshore Cascadia source region, and an updated communication to the coastal communities about the importance of knowing the natural warning signs of a Cascadia tsunami and the self-evacuation actions that should be taken immediately upon strong ground shaking, without waiting for an official warning. These actions are proportionate to the current state of the evidence and are consistent with the operational response to a probabilistic update in the near-term hazard assessment rather than a specific threat warning. The seismologist who flagged the magnitude 3.1 earthquake has been at the center of the investigation for the weeks since she sent the 4-sentence message to the research group. She has been running the catalog analysis, participating in the stress modeling discussions, reviewing the waveform data, contributing to the coordination with the geodetic research group, and helping to prepare the preliminary communication to the emergency management community. She's also been thinking about what it means to be watching a fault system that has the potential to produce the most destructive natural disaster in North American history, and to be detecting signals in the monitoring data that could mean many different things but that are not, in their current combination and their current context, consistent with the straightforward conclusion that nothing unusual is happening. She is not predicting an earthquake. She is careful and consistent about this. She does not know, and the science does not support the claim, that the signals she is seeing are reliable precursors to a major Cascadia rupture in any specific time window. What she knows is that the signals are real, that they are outside the normal range of behavior that the monitoring program has documented in its period of operation, and that they are occurring in a fault system that is loaded with 326 years of accumulated elastic strain, and that has a history of producing great earthquakes at intervals that make the current elapsed time relevant to the hazard assessment. She thinks about the 1700 earthquake sometimes, the earthquake that set the record that Cascadia is currently measuring its elapsed time against. The earthquake that rang church bells in the Japanese coastal village where the tsunami arrived, that dropped the coasts of the Pacific Northwest by as much as 2 meters in some places, that killed trees and inundated marshes, and left in the sedimentary record the evidence that paleoseismologists have spent careers reading. The earthquake that occurred, as all Cascadia earthquakes have occurred, without any warning that the people living along the coast could interpret, without a monitoring network to detect the slow slip anomalies or the elevated seismicity rates or the GPS deformation patterns that the current science is capable of detecting, without any scientific infrastructure to translate the signals into the probabilistic assessments that give communities the information they need to prepare. The scientific infrastructure exists now. It detected something. The something is being examined with the rigor and the care that the stakes demand. The signals that the investigation is finding, in their combination, in their context, and their timing, are the reason that the scientists who are examining them are on edge, not because they know what is coming, but because they know what the system beneath their monitoring network is capable of, and because the signals they are seeing are not telling them to relax. The Pacific Northwest is waiting, as it has been waiting for 326 years, for the fault that runs beneath it to release the energy it has been accumulating since the last time it moved. The monitoring system that the scientific community has built to watch that waiting is now showing something in its data that was not there before and that is not yet fully understood. The scientists are watching it carefully. The emergency managers have been briefed. The communities have been educated as well as the resources available have allowed. And the small earthquake, the magnitude 3.1 that the seismologist almost logged and moved on from, is in the catalog now, a permanent entry in the record of what the Cascadia Subduction Zone was doing in this specific period of its loading history. It may mean something. The investigation is working to determine what. The watching continues, as it must continue as long as the fault is loaded, and the people above it deserve the best possible warning of what it intends to do next. The timing of this small earthquake has scientists on edge because of everything that surrounds it. The earthquake itself is small. What surrounds it is not.